The most famous sentence in French history was never spoken by the woman who is famous for saying it. It appeared, in a slightly different form, and about bread rather than cake, in a book Jean-Jacques Rousseau was drafting in the 1760s, attributed to a great princess he does not name. When Rousseau set those words down, Marie Antoinette was 9 years old and living in Vienna, and would not cross the French frontier for another 5 years. Nobody accused her of the line in 1789. Nobody accused her of it at her trial, where they accused her of everything else there was. It was first printed against her name in 1841, 48 years after she was dead, by a journalist who hedged it even as he printed it, and who retracted it 18 months later. She has been carrying it ever since, because the story underneath the sentence is not the story of a queen who did not care. It is the story of a girl of 14 taken to a wooden building on an island in the middle of the Rhine, undressed in front of strangers, and handed across a river as the physical signature on a treaty. Her household went back to Vienna. Every stitch she stood up in went back, so that she should carry nothing of a foreign country into her new one. And France went on taking things. 7 years of a marriage conducted in public, a court that called her the Austrian woman from the first week, a fraud she was entirely innocent of, which destroyed her regardless, a trade in obscene pamphlets that made men rich, a son removed from her and taught to accuse her, and at the end of it, an open cart. She was 37 years old, and her hair, by the accounts of everyone who saw her at the end, had gone white. This is what actually happened. She was born in Vienna on the 2nd of November, 1755, in the Hofburg on a cold grey afternoon at the beginning of winter, and the world had ended the day before. Not in Vienna. 1,500 miles to the west, on the morning of All Saints' Day, while the churches of Lisbon stood full and the candles were lit, the ground beneath the richest port in Europe had opened, and the cathedrals had come down on the congregations inside them, and the sea had drawn back out of the harbour, and then returned. Tens of thousands died in a single morning. The news travelled north at the speed of a horse and reached the Austrian court in the days after the Empress was delivered of her 15th child. And it became, because everything in this story would eventually be reread backwards, the first sentence in a legend. She was the girl born the day after the world fell down. It meant nothing at the time. Nobody wrote it down as an omen until long afterwards, when there was a reason to. They christened her Maria Antonia, Josefa Johanna, and within the family she was Antoine, and for the first 13 years of her life she was very nearly the least significant person in one of the most consequential households in Europe. Her mother had seen to that, chiefly by having so many others. Maria Theresa did not preside over a family. She commanded an instrument. She had come to the throne at 23 with 3 armies marching on her inheritance and no training whatsoever for the job, and she had held the Habsburg lands together by nerve, piety, industry, and an absolute refusal to be embarrassed, and she had done it while producing 16 children in 19 years, 11 of whom lived to be adults. She was not a cold woman. She was affectionate, demonstrative, endlessly interfering, and she wrote to her children with a warmth that makes the content of the letters harder to bear rather than easier. But she had been raised to understand that a Habsburg daughter was a diplomatic asset with a face, and she raised her own daughters in that understanding and never once pretended otherwise. They went out one by one into the courts of Europe as the policy required. And in October 1767, when the smallpox went through the Hofburg and killed the 16-year-old Archduchess Maria Josefa, a few days before she was due to leave for her marriage in Naples, the arrangement was not cancelled, it was reassigned. Another sister, Maria Carolina, was substituted into the same treaty, the same bridegroom, the same bed. She wrote afterwards that she had wept for days and that it had made no difference to anybody. The lesson was available to everyone in that palace who cared to notice it, and the youngest daughter was 12 years old when it was taught. The girls were interchangeable. What mattered was the marriage. The marriage was the point, and the marriage that mattered most had already been decided in principle when she was an infant. In 1756, the Austrian Chancellor Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz had performed the most audacious maneuver in 18th century diplomacy. For 2.5 centuries, the House of Austria and the Kingdom of France had been the fixed poles of European enmity. Dynastic rivals, religious rivals, rivals across a dozen wars and 4 generations. Kaunitz reversed it. He abandoned the old alliance with Britain, went to Versailles, and constructed an Austro-French partnership that startled every chancellery on the continent. Then came the 7 Years' War, and the new alliance performed badly, and Austria did not recover Silesia, and by the time the guns stopped in 1763, the arrangement was deeply unpopular in Paris and not much loved in Vienna. It needed something to hold it together. It needed a seal and a hostage and a guarantee, and the 18th century had one instrument that served as all 3 at once. Her name had been on the list before she could read, which was, as it happened, later than anyone in Paris would have liked. Because for all the machinery around her, nobody in Vienna had actually educated the child. She was quick, charming, physically graceful, musical, and comprehensively untaught. When the French court sent the Abbé de Vermont to Vienna in 1768 to prepare the intended bride, he found a girl of 13 whose German was careless, whose French was thin, whose spelling was inventive in both, and who could not sit still for a quarter of an hour together. Her handwriting was the worst of it. Her governesses, wanting a quiet morning, had fallen into the practice of writing her exercises out for her in pencil so that she could simply follow the lines over in ink, and the result was a hand that looked like a child's and belonged to nobody. Vermond, who was a sensible man and grew genuinely fond of her, reported all of this to France with as much diplomacy as he could manage and set about teaching her to write. Remember the handwriting. It will be the hinge on which this entire story eventually turns. Then they rebuilt the rest of her. A French dentist spent months straightening her teeth with a wire brace without anesthetic because there was none. A French hairdresser was sent from Paris to reshape her hairline, which was judged too low for the coiffures of Versailles. A dancing master taught her the gliding, hipless walk of the French court, a specific and recognizable gait that took months to acquire and that foreigners never quite managed. And the painter Joseph Ducreux came out from Paris in 1769 to make a portrait of her, so that a boy at Versailles could be shown what was coming. She was 14 years old, and she had been, in the most literal sense available, manufactured. The proxy wedding took place on the 19th of April 1770 in the Augustinian church in Vienna, with her brother Ferdinand standing in the bridegroom's place because the bridegroom himself was 800 miles away, and the two of them had never met, never spoken, and never exchanged a letter that either of them had written unassisted. 2 days later, she left. The convoy that went out of Vienna on the 21st of April 1770 was itself a political statement. 21 state coaches, 36 carriages, 450 horses at the relays, and a suite of more than 250 people moving west at walking pace so that as much of Europe as possible could see it go. Her mother came out to the courtyard. There was a great deal of weeping from both of them in front of everybody, which was not at all the Habsburg way and was remarked upon, and Maria Theresa put a paper into her daughter's hand. It was not a keepsake. It was a règlement, a rule of life, written out in the Empress's own hand, setting down what the girl was to read, and when she was to pray, and how she was to conduct herself, and whom she was to trust, together with the instruction that she was to take it out and read it again on the 21st day of every month for as long as she lived. There would be letters as well. There would be letters every month for the next 10 years, and they would arrive with the regularity of a bill. She was 14 years and 5 months old, and she had just been handed a set of instructions for a country she had never seen by a mother she would never see again. The convoy went west for 16 days, through Bavaria and Swabia, and at every stage the crowds came out to look at her, and at every stage she was still an Austrian archduchess, travelling with her own household, wearing her own clothes, attended by her own women. On the 7th of May, 1770, the carriages came down through the trees to the Rhine, near Kehl, and stopped at the edge of the water. Out in the middle of the river was a low, flat, uninhabited island that belonged to neither kingdom, and on the island stood a wooden building of 5 rooms that had been thrown up for one single afternoon's use and would be pulled down again afterwards. 2 chambers on the Austrian side, 2 chambers on the French side, and 1 room in the middle, standing exactly on the frontier with a table in it. She had been told what was going to happen in that building. She had not, by any account that survives, been told what it was going to feel like. The island had no name worth recording, and nobody had ever lived on it. It was a low bar of silt and willow lying in the Rhine between Kehl on the German bank and Strasbourg on the French, and its single qualification for the use it was about to be put to was that it belonged to nobody at all. That was the entire point of it. What had to happen on the 7th of May 1770 could not be done in Austria, because the girl had to arrive in France, already French, and it could not be done in France because she had to be given up by Austria while she was still Austrian. The 18th century, which had a procedure for everything, solved the difficulty the way it solved most difficulties, with carpentry and a legal fiction. It put a building on a sandbank in the middle of a river and agreed that the ground underneath it was nowhere. The building had 5 rooms. 2 of them were Austrian and faced the German shore. 2 of them were French and faced the French, and between them stood the salle de remise, the room of the handing over, with a long table down the centre of it, set precisely along a frontier that existed on no map and in no soil. On one side of that table lay the Empire. On the other side lay the Kingdom of France. The whole thing had been thrown up in a few weeks out of raw timber, furnished with whatever could be borrowed from the great houses of the province, used for a single afternoon, and then pulled down again, so that within a season there was nothing on the island but grass. They had covered the bare walls with tapestry, because bare walls would not do. The set they borrowed told the story of Jason and Medea and Creusa, a foreign princess who leaves her own country for a husband from another, is betrayed by him, destroys the young bride who replaces her, and then kills her own children. It was a remarkable thing to hang around a girl of 14 on her wedding journey, and at least one person thought so at the time. A law student of 20 at the university in Strasbourg, who walked out with friends to look at the pavilion before the ceremony, and stood in front of those hangings in something close to anger. His name was Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Whoever chose them, he wrote, had understood nothing whatever. Of all the stories in the ancient world, this was the one that should never have been set out in silk to welcome a bride. That anecdote needs handling with care. Goethe published the recollection some 40 years afterwards in his memoirs, by which time every literate person in Europe knew exactly how the marriage had ended, and hindsight is the cheapest of all the prophetic gifts. But the tapestries were certainly hanging there, he certainly saw them, and whatever he felt standing in that room stayed with him for 4 decades. She was brought onto the island in the afternoon and taken into the Austrian rooms, and there the ceremony began by taking everything off her. That is not a figure of speech, and it was not an oversight. The formula recorded at the time was that the bride should retain nothing whatsoever belonging to a foreign court, and the formula was executed to the letter in a wooden room in front of an audience. Her clothes were taken from her, all of them, down to the shift and the stockings and the ribbons in her hair, and passed out of her hands, and she was dressed again from the skin outward in French linen, French silk, French shoes, none of which she had chosen, and most of which she had never seen. The rings came off her fingers. The Austrian household that had travelled 16 days at walking pace to bring her there, her women and her servants, and the people who spoke to her in the language she still thought in, were turned round at the door and sent back over the bridge to Kehl. The accounts add that even the little dog she had brought from Vienna went back across the river, and that detail belongs to the truth of the room, whether or not it can be documented, because the protocols of such occasions record property and not attachments. She wept. More than one witness recorded that she wept, and that she then collected herself and apologized for it, which is worse. She was 14 years and 6 months old, and she had just been undressed in a shed on a sandbank by strangers who believed they were doing her an honor. Then the doors of the middle room were opened, and she was led to the table on the line and given up, and walked out through the other side into France. The girl who went in was Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, Archduchess of Austria. The one who came out was Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France, and everything she had on was new. It was the first inventory in her life. There would be one more 23 years later in the same country, and the second list would be very short. Strasbourg took her that evening with arches and illuminations and children in white, and a Te Deum in the cathedral, and then the procession moved on. For a fortnight it went west across France at the pace of a walking horse, through towns that had been ordered to be delighted, and mostly were, and on the 14th of May it came into the forest of Compiègne, where the King of France was waiting at the edge of the trees with his court behind him. Louis XV was 60 years old. He had been on the throne since he was 5. He had outlived almost everyone who had begun the reign with him, and he was still the most graceful man in any room he entered. He was charmed with her immediately. Nearly everyone was at the beginning. The boy beside him was harder work.
Louis Auguste, Dauphin of France, was 15. Tall, heavy, badly short-sighted, silent in company, most content with a gun in his hand or a lock in pieces on a table. He had lost his father at 11 and his mother at 12, and had been brought up since by men who had taught him that his grandfather's court was corrupt, that his own inheritance was a burden, and that almost every pleasure available to him was a moral risk. He bowed to her, he kissed her cheek because the ceremonial required it. And by every surviving account of that afternoon, he said very nearly nothing at all. 2 days later they were at Versailles. The wedding was on the 16th of May 1770 in the royal chapel before the Archbishop of Rheims, in front of the whole court in full dress. She was 14 and he was 15, and they had known one another for 2 days.
Afterwards they signed the register, and her signature is the thing that survives best from that morning. An unformed, effortful schoolroom hand, the hand the Abbé de Vermont had spent 2 years trying to build out of nothing, and across it a blot of ink. Whether that was a bad pen or a shaking one cannot be established at this distance. It is simply there, on the parchment permanently, the first mark she ever made, on the official record of France. They had built a theatre for the wedding and finished it barely in time, and the banquet was held in it that evening under 6 100,000 candles. The gardens were to be lit afterwards, and the fireworks were to be the greatest ever seen in the park. Then the weather turned. A storm came over Versailles, the rain came down in sheets, the display was cancelled, and something like 10,000 people who had come out from Paris to watch it walked home in the dark and the wet. And then the last ceremony of the day, which was not in any sense a private one. The bed was blessed. The couple were undressed by the officers of the household and put into it in front of as many of the royal family and the court as had the right to be there, and that right was a valuable piece of property allocated by rank and jealously counted. The king himself handed his grandson his nightshirt. The curtains were drawn. Then the room emptied, though only as far as the next room. Nothing happened. Not that night, and not the next, and not for a very long time afterwards. And because this was Versailles, where the king's household included men whose entire function was to be present when the king's grandson woke up, everybody knew it by the following morning, and the ambassadors knew it by the following week, and within a month it was being discussed in code, in dispatches, to Vienna, Madrid, and Naples. She was 14 years old, and her body had become a matter of foreign policy. And 2 weeks later, on the 30th of May, the city of Paris held its own celebration for the marriage in the great square at the end of the Tuileries Gardens, and a rocket fell into the unfired stock, and the crowd turned and ran into a street that was still a building site. They carried the bodies out for most of the night. The official count was 132, which makes it, to this day, the deadliest firework accident that has ever happened anywhere. The real figure was certainly higher, and nobody has ever established it. It was the first thing that happened in France in her name. They laid the dead out in rows along the Rue Royale, and for 2 days the people of Paris walked the lines looking for faces they knew. At Versailles, the boy and girl in whose honour it had been lit sent their own money into the city for the families. The story that the Dauphin sent a full year's allowance cannot be firmly documented. That something was sent quickly and unasked is not. Paris said thank you. Paris also said, in the way cities do, that a marriage beginning like that had not been blessed. Then she went back up the hill, and Versailles began to explain what she now was. It is a mistake to picture a palace in the sense of a large house belonging to a family. Versailles, in 1770, was an instrument of government with a roof over it, holding several thousand people on an ordinary day. It was also astonishingly open. Any respectably dressed person could walk in off the road and watch, and the only requirement was a sword at the hip, which the men at the gate would rent you, because that was the function of the place. Every gesture in that building had an owner. The king's waking was not a private act, but a public office. The lever performed in stages, with entry at each stage allotted by rank and defended like land. It was never about comfort. It was about being seen. And what was done to the king was done in a lesser key to the 14-year-old who had married his grandson. The dressing was the worst of it. Her shift, the plain linen garment worn next to the skin, could not simply be handed to her. It had to pass through the hands of the highest-ranking woman present, and if a grander woman came in while it was in transit, it went back and began again. Madame Campan, whose memoirs are reliable in outline and generous to their author in the details, describes a winter morning on which the shift travelled through 3 pairs of hands, while the Dauphine of France stood undressed, waiting for precedents to resolve. She found it unbearable, and she said so, and she lost. The argument was never about a garment. It was about whether the machine could be interrupted by the person at its centre, and at Versailles the answer was no. There were 1,000 such rules, and she was made to learn all of them. One was so small it can hardly have cost a morning. The royal family of France did not sign as other people signed. A duke signed with his duchy, a bishop with his see. The king signed Louis and stopped. The princes and princesses of the blood signed with the names they had been given at the font and put nothing after them, no family, no territory, no of anywhere, because a family that was the state did not need to say which state. From that summer, every page she put her hand to carried 2 words and no others. Marie Antoinette. Nothing following. Remember the signature. 15 years later, a prince of the church would stand holding a sheet of paper with 2 words, too many at the bottom of it, and would see nothing wrong. Her instruction in all of this came from the kindest source available, which was also the most dangerous. Mesdames Adélaïde, Victoire, and Sophie were 3 of Louis XV's unmarried daughters, then in their 30s, devout, unoccupied, intelligent enough to be bored, and grand enough to be listened to. They had built a small kingdom out of grievance, and they disapproved of their father's private life, of his mistress, and above all of the Austrian alliance. Into their apartments that summer came a lonely 14-year-old with nothing whatever to do, and they were charming to her. And she went to them nearly every day. The word was made in those rooms. L'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman. The Château de Versailles credits Madame Adélaïde with coining it, and it was in use from 1770, when the girl it described had not yet done anything at all. That is the fact that matters. It did not rise out of the street, and it was not the Revolution's invention. It was made indoors by the royal family of France about a child sent to marry into it. The last syllable is also the French word for a female dog, and nobody then missed it, and 20 years later it would be printed on pamphlet covers. It is stated here once, and not repeated. Then the aunts found her something to do with it. Jeanne Bécu, Comtesse du Barry, was the king's mistress, a former courtesan, married off to a complaisant count so that she could be presented at court, and installed in 1769 as maîtresse en titre. The etiquette was exact. A person of lower rank could not open a conversation with the Dauphin, so du Barry could not speak first. Only Marie Antoinette could break the silence, and the aunts explained to their new niece, gently and often, that a virtuous princess would never dream of it. She did not dream of it for nearly 2 years. What began as obedience hardened into character. She discovered a talent for the immovable, the first appearance of a quality that would one day be the most admired thing about her, and was already the most expensive. And the silence became an affair of state. The king was being humiliated in his own house by a girl of 15. Vienna wrote to Paris, and Paris to Vienna, and at last the Empress wrote to say that the alliance her daughter's life had been built to secure was being risked rather than speak one sentence to a woman she disliked. On the 1st of January 1772, at the New Year reception, the Dauphine of France stopped before the Comtesse du Barry and observed that there were a great many people at Versailles that day. The wording varies a little between the accounts. All of them agree on its emptiness. It was one remark about a crowd, and everyone in that room understood what had just happened. A courier left for Vienna. The 2 women never spoke again. 21 years later they would be killed in the same square in Paris, less than 2 months apart. The Comte de Mercy-Argenteau was Austria's man in France, and his real employment was not the embassy. Every month a confidential report went from his desk to the Empress, covering her daughter. What she had said, and to whom, what she had spent, who was rising in her favor, and the state of her body, including her monthly cycle. The replies came back on the same schedule. They were not letters, they were briefs. On the 31st of October 1771, the Empress told her that all of it made her tremble, that she saw her going with a certain complacency and carelessness, a grand pas, a great stride, toward her own ruin. She was 15 years old. From the age of 14 she had been watched by both of the countries she belonged to, and reported on by both, and neither of them was watching on her behalf. Nothing that followed was criminal. That is the thing to hold on to, the riding she was told not to do, the card table where she lost more than she had, the laughter imperfectly concealed at an old duchess whose wig belonged to another reign. She was a teenager in a building where nobody was ever off duty. Each item was trivial. Each item was written down. For 4 years the arrangement held, the aunts whispering, the ambassador reporting, the letters arriving from Vienna on the 21st of every month with their careful, unanswerable cruelty, and a girl in her teens learning that at Versailles there was no such thing as a private failure. And then on the 27th of April, 1774, at the Petit Trianon, the King of France complained of a headache. They took him back to the great palace because kings did not die at Trianon, and by the 29th the pustules had come up across his face, and the word that nobody in that building could say aloud was said anyway, in the corridors, because it was the word everybody had been dreading since 1730. Smallpox. He was 64, and along the length of the hall of mirrors, in every antechamber and every stairwell, several thousand people who had spent their entire lives calculating who mattered began, very quietly, to recalculate. They put a candle in the window. It stood on the sill of the king's bedchamber at Versailles, lit and watched, and every person in that enormous building understood the arrangement without needing to be told. While the flame burned, Louis XV was alive. When it went out, France had a new king. For a fortnight the old man had been dying in the most public building in Europe. He had come to the throne as a child of 5 in 1715, and he had reigned for 59 years. And somewhere in the middle of all that he had been called the Well-Beloved, a name nobody had used in earnest for 20 years. Now he lay in a shuttered room with the smallpox on him, attended by physicians who could do nothing, and by priests who were waiting, with professional patience, for him to send his mistress away so that they might give him the sacraments. Madame du Barry left on the 4th of May in a closed carriage. The sacraments followed. And at about 3:15 in the afternoon of the 10th of May, 1774, the candle on the window-sill went out. What happened in the next 10 seconds is the reason this chapter has the title it has. A court is not a household. A court is a market, and in that instant every position in it had been repriced at once. Every pension, every office, every appointment, every marriage under negotiation, every friendship and every grudge. Several hundred people had been standing in the antechambers and along the length of the great gallery for days, waiting for exactly this. And when the light went out, they turned, all of them together, and ran. Madame Campan, who was in the young couple's apartments that afternoon, and who wrote her memoirs nearly 50 years afterwards, said the noise was like thunder rolling through the palace. That was the sound of the entire court of France, sprinting down a corridor to be first into the room where the new king was, because to be first was to be seen to be first, and at Versailles being seen was the only currency there was. They arrived at a door. Behind it were a boy of 19 and a girl of 18. Campan, and Campan alone, in a memoir published nearly half a century later, records that the two of them went down on their knees when the noise reached them, and that one of them said they were too young to reign. It is the most quoted sentence of that afternoon, and it rests on a single source writing long after the fact. Take it as you find it. What is not in doubt is the rest. The court left the palace within hours because the disease was still in the building. The body of Louis XV was carried to Saint-Denis at night, at speed, in a sealed carriage with a fraction of the ceremony a king of France was owed. And along the road, by more than one account, people jeered at it as it went by. Madame du Barry was banished within the week to a convent at Pont-aux-Dames. She was 31 years old, and 8 days earlier she had been the most powerful woman in France. That is how quickly it could happen. It is worth remembering, for 4 years Marie Antoinette had been a foreigner on approval in a house that did not want her, instructed by the king's aunts, reported on every month to Vienna by her own side, and blamed in public for a failure in a bed she had been put into at 14. On the 9th of May, she was a dauphine whose only political achievement was a single sentence spoken across a room to a courtesan. On the 11th, she was Queen of France, and for a while, for the better part of a year, which is longer than it sounds, it went extraordinarily well. The new reign opened with a run of decisions the country liked. The old ministry was swept out, and the Comte de Maurepas, an experienced man of 73 who had been in exile from court for a quarter of a century, was brought back to advise. Turgot, a provincial administrator with a reputation for competence and a reforming program that was genuinely radical, was made Controller General. And in June 1774 the king had himself and both his brothers inoculated against the disease that had just killed his grandfather, a procedure that still carried a real risk of killing the patient, performed on the person of the sovereign 6 weeks into a reign. It was brave, and it was popular, and the fashionable women of Paris are said to have worn a hairstyle in its honor, which tells you a good deal about the mood of that summer. She was part of that mood. This has to be said plainly, because everything that follows is the story of it being taken away from her. At the beginning, she was loved. When she went into Paris, the crowds were enormous, and they were delighted with her. The governor of the city is supposed to have told her that she had 200,000 people in love with her, a remark that appears in the later accounts rather than the contemporary ones, and which nevertheless describes something entirely real. She was young, she was graceful, she was gracious in public, in a way the old king had long since stopped troubling to be. France had decided provisionally to like her. Then came the bread. Turgot's central conviction was that the grain trade should be free, and in September 1774 he freed it. The harvest had been poor. Prices climbed through the winter and went sharply up in the spring, and in April and May 1775 the Paris basin came apart. Markets forced, bakeries emptied, grain barges stopped on the rivers, prices fixed by crowds at what the crowds believed was just, across dozens of towns and villages for the better part of 3 weeks. It is remembered as the Flower War. Troops were sent out along the roads. A crowd came to the gates of Versailles itself. And when it was over, the government raised gallows in Paris and hanged 2 men, one of them, by the usual account, a wigmaker's apprentice, as an example to everybody else. And in June 1775, in the same weeks, the Queen of France sat down and wrote to her mother about the people who had been rioting over the price of bread. This is what she wrote. "It is quite certain," she said, "that in seeing the people who treat us so well despite their own misfortune, we are more obliged than ever to work hard for their happiness. That is the whole of it, and it is worth stopping the film for. As far as anyone has been able to establish, that sentence is the only surviving occasion on which Marie Antoinette wrote anything whatsoever about hungry French people. It is not callous, it is not even indifferent. It is a 19-year-old setting down, a little stiffly, the conventional piety of her caste, the duty of the great toward the poor, and it is almost word for word the exact inverse of the sentence the world eventually decided she had said about bread. She never said that sentence. Nobody accused her of it while she was alive to answer. This one she actually wrote in her own hand to her mother in the middle of a bread riot, and almost nobody has ever heard it. Remember it. It comes back at the end of this film. The coronation was held at Rhine on the 11th of June, 1775, and it was his, not hers. Kings of France were anointed there with the holy oil in a ceremony that made them something more than administrative. Queens were consecrated separately at Saint-Denis, or not at all. She was never crowned. She was never anointed. She watched the whole thing from a gallery above the nave, and by the accounts of people in the cathedral she wept, and the king is said to have looked up at her. Turgot had argued for something cheaper and nearer Paris, and had been overruled, so the ceremony went forward in full at Reims a few weeks after soldiers had put down riots about the price of a loaf. Nobody at court appears to have found the sequence remarkable. In that same year, in 1774, in fact, on a day the sources cannot agree about, the king had made her a present. The Petit Trianon was a small square neoclassical house in the park, a mile from the palace, built for Louis XV by Ange-Jacques Gabriel, and finished a few years before he died. It had fewer than a dozen principal rooms. Louis XVI gave it to his wife outright. The line attached to the gift ever since, that as she loved flowers, he had a bouquet for her, comes from a chronicle written after the event, and French scholarship treats it as doubtful, reportedly, at most. The phrasing does not matter. The legal fact underneath it matters enormously, and the legal fact was that the house was hers, and that from that day forward the question of who was permitted to walk through its door was hers alone to answer. That is a very small sentence. It will take some years to detonate. Remember the door. And in those same years, in a workshop in Paris, two men were building something. Charles Boehmer and Paul Bassange were court jewelers, and from about 1772 they had been assembling the largest and most expensive object in France, a rivière of brilliants in festoons, swags and tassels, several rows deep, made to lie across the shoulders and fall to the waist, put together stone by stone over years out of the diamond markets of Europe. Whether Louis XV formally commissioned it, or whether they built it on speculation in the confident expectation that he would want it, the sources do not agree. Who it was intended for is not in dispute at all. It was for Madame du Barry. They were asking something in the region of 2 million livres, a figure with no useful modern equivalent, best understood this way. It was worth more than a first-rate warship, and the jewelers had borrowed against everything they had to buy the stones. And then, at about 3:15, in the afternoon of the 10th of May, 1774, the candle went out in the window. So by the summer of 1775, she had all of it. She had the palace and the park, and the little house behind the trees that nobody could enter without her permission. She had a husband who was kind to her and afraid of her, and could refuse her nothing. She had a country that came out into the streets of Paris to look at her, and went home saying that the new queen was charming. She was 19 years old, and she had been in France for 5 years, and the only thing she did not have was the one thing she had been sent there to produce. 5 years, 2 courts, 3 ambassadors, a mother in Vienna writing every month, and a marriage that had still, after 5 years, never once been a marriage at all. In Paris they had begun to sing about it, And in a jeweller's workshop in Paris, two men who had gambled everything on a dead king's mistress were sitting on 647 diamonds that nobody on earth could now afford, and beginning to think about whom they might approach next. 7 years, not a cold marriage or an unhappy one, or one that struggled and then came right. 7 years in which the marriage did not, in the only sense the 18th century recognized, exist at all. From the 16th of May, 1770, when a girl of 14 and a boy of 15 were put into a blessed bed in front of the court of France, till the 18th of August, 1777. 7 years and 3 months. Every month of it was reported. The heir to the French throne had no private life, not as a misfortune, but as a matter of design. Men held salaried office at Versailles for the sole purpose of being present when he woke and when he went to bed. Where he had slept, and whether his wife had been there, was known to several hundred people by morning, and to Vienna, Madrid, and Naples within the month, in cipher. By 1772, there was not a chancellery of consequence in Europe without a file on whether these two adolescents had consummated their marriage. And the failure was hers, immediately, publicly, and for 7 years, because she was the foreigner, because she was the woman, and because the only other explanation was an insult to the King of France, which nobody at Versailles said aloud. The songs in Paris were about her. She was 15. Then she was 17. Then she was 21. What was actually wrong has been answered confidently for 2 centuries, mostly by people in no position to know. The durable story is that the king suffered a minor physical defect requiring a small operation, a suggestion first raised by royal physicians in late 1772 and embroidered ever since. It is a persistent hypothesis that the surviving evidence does not support. He was examined more than once and no abnormality was recorded. As late as 1777, the Prussian envoy, Baron Goltz, reported that the king had declined the operation, declined it, not undergone it. And modern historians, Antonia Fraser prominent among them, find no reliable evidence that any such surgery took place. The truth was duller. The truth almost always is. 2 badly advised and comprehensively uninstructed young people in a bed that half of Europe was writing letters about. Vienna never let it alone for a month. The Comte de Mercy Argenteau, Austrian ambassador, and her mother's private intelligence officer reported on her monthly, her friends, her spending, her conversation, her health, her cycle. In June 1775, the Empress wrote that all the letters from Paris were saying her daughter slept apart from the king. In August, she wrote that it was a long time since she had heard anything on that important chapter. That was the phrase a mother used by diplomatic bag to interrogate her 19-year-old daughter about her sexual life. That important chapter. On the 6th of August 1775, the Comte d'Artois, the king's youngest brother, had a son, a boy who now stood in the succession where her own child should have stood. 6 days later she wrote to her mother that she had suffered a great deal at seeing an heir who was not hers. And in the spring of 1777, Vienna sent a man. Joseph II, Holy Roman Emperor, her eldest surviving brother, a restless and impatient reformer, crossed into France on the 19th of April 1777, travelling incognito as the Comte de Falkenstein. He refused the state apartments, refused to be received as an emperor at all, met his sister and her husband at the Château de la Muette, and spent 6 weeks inspecting hospitals, workshops and public works with the air of a man taking an inventory. The principal thing he had come to inspect was his sister's marriage. That sentence is worth reading twice. A reigning emperor crossed Europe under a false name to establish why a 21-year-old woman was not pregnant, and to instruct her and her husband separately, then together, in explicit detail, in what they were doing wrong. Whatever else is uncertain about those 7 years, this is not. She had never had privacy. By 1777, she did not have even the privacy of failure. His verdict went to their brother Leopold on the 9th of June 1777, and it remains the best evidence anyone has. She was an agreeable and honest woman, he wrote, a little young and not much given to reflection, in whom the desire to amuse herself was very powerful. Her husband was somewhat weak, but no imbecile, and the trouble was an apathy of body as much as of mind. Together they were, in his phrase, two complete blunderers. The fiat lux had not come, the matter was still unformed. The letter goes into clinical particulars this film will not follow, and describes no defect requiring a surgeon. Then on the 29th of May, 1777, the day before he left, he did something else. He wrote out for her, in his own hand, a memorandum of some 20 pages, signed and dated, and left it behind. It is not a letter, it is an audit of a life. He told her she was frivolous, that she was cold to her husband, that she gave her friendship to whoever amused her, and asked her by what right she supposed the French honoured her at all, except as the companion of their king. And then he wrote this. He trembled for her, he said, because in the long run this could not go on, and the revolution would be a cruel one if she did not prepare it. He used the word revolution. In May 1777, 12 years before the Bastille. On the 18th of August 1777, 11 weeks after he left France, the marriage was consummated. Both of them wrote to Vienna, so did the ambassador, and the relief in the dispatches of that autumn is audible across 2.5 centuries. No surgeon appears in the record of that summer. What appears is a conversation. It should have ended there. It did not. 7 years is long enough to teach a country a habit, and France had been invited to take a close interest in the reproductive life of one young woman, and had accepted. The earliest pamphlets attacking her supposed sexual conduct belonged to these years, not to the Revolution, printed and sold while she was, in point of fact, still a virgin. The libel arrived before there was any behaviour to describe. The child came on the 19th of December, 1778. By a custom older than anyone could account for, a royal birth in France was public, because the succession rested on witnesses who could swear no infant had been smuggled into the room. In practice, the doors were opened. They came in at a run, the room filled and went on filling, and by the accounts of those present, some climbed onto the furniture to see over the heads in front. The chamber was sealed against the December cold. The air gave out. She convulsed and lost consciousness, and for some minutes those around the bed believed she was dying. Madame Campan, who was there, and wrote of it long afterwards, says, "The king forced the windows open with his own hands. The surgeon bled her. She came back. Louis XVI abolished the custom that day, and no crowd was ever admitted to a French royal birth again." The child was a girl. In the courtyard below, the cannon that had been loaded to announce the birth of a dauphin were quietly unloaded again, because the guns of France did not fire for daughters. And in the street outside the palace gates, where the crowd had waited all night in December, the news went round, and the crowd went home. She did not care. By every surviving account, she was, for the first time since she had crossed the Rhine, completely and uncomplicatedly happy. She is reported to have told the baby that a son would have belonged to the state, but that a daughter would be hers. 8 years of humiliation had ended. She was 23. And what she did not yet understand was that the country had spent those 8 years learning something about her that it was never going to unlearn. that the Queen of France was a woman whose private life belonged to everybody, that speculating about it was permitted, and that it sold. Somewhere in Paris, the presses that would eventually destroy her were already running. They had simply not yet found the story. A mile from the great palace, at the far end of the park, beyond the water and the avenues and the clipped geometry that Louis XIV had imposed on the ground, the way a general imposes order on a battlefield, there stood a small, square house of pale stone with 4 principal rooms on its main floor. It had been built for somebody else. Louis XV had ordered it in the 1760s at the urging of Madame de Pompadour, who died before it was finished, and never once set foot inside it. His next mistress used it, and in 1774 his grandson, who was 19 years old, and did not know what else to give a wife he could not otherwise please, gave it to Marie Antoinette. The charming story that he presented it with a remark about her love of flowers and a bouquet comes from a chronicle written after the event, and French scholarship treats it as doubtful. The legal fact is not doubtful, and the legal fact was the whole of it. The Petit Trianon was hers, not hers to use as the king's wife, in the way that every stone at Versailles was ultimately the king's, hers to furnish, to alter, to pull down and rebuild, and above all, to admit people to or not. That last clause sounds like a matter of housekeeping. It was the most consequential political act of her life, because at Versailles access was a function of birth. The right to stand in a particular room at a particular hour, to hand a particular garment, to sit on a stool where others stood, was the visible ledger of what a family had done for the crown across 3 or 4 centuries, and men mortgaged their estates for a generation to secure it. This was not vanity. It was the entire working currency of the French nobility, and the king minted it simply by being looked at. At Trianon, access was a function of whether the queen liked you. There was no other qualification, and there was no appeal. The invitations came from her personally. The servants there wore her livery and not the king's. And by an arrangement that delighted her, and that nobody outside the hedge found amusing at all, the King of France came down to the little house at the end of the park as his wife's guest. She began pulling up the garden in 1775. The formal beds went, and the straight lines went with them, and in their place the architect Richard Meek laid out the fashionable English-Chinese landscape: a winding stream, an artificial rock, a lake, irregular groves, a whole countryside arranged at enormous expense to look like something that had simply happened. In 1778 they inaugurated a temple of love on the island in the water, a ring of white columns on a low mound, with a figure of Cupid at the centre of it. There was a belvedere, octagonal, for music. And in June 1780 she opened a theatre. It seated about 250 people, and it is the one building on the estate that came through the following century intact. She performed in it herself in light comedy and comic opera before audiences of a dozen or so invited friends and sometimes her husband. She played maids and village girls. The Queen of France stood on a private stage and played a servant, and the nobility of France was not admitted to watch. And then, from the summer of 1783, at the far edge of the estate, she built a village. The Hameau de la Reine took 3 years to raise, and longer to fit out. Meek again as architect, with the painter Hubert Robert advising on how the thing ought to look. And when it was finished, there were a dozen buildings standing around an artificial lake. Cottages, a dairy, a mill, a tower, a barn, all of it in the vernacular of Norman farm architecture, thatch and timber and rendered plaster. Cracks were painted onto the new walls so that the buildings would appear to have been standing for 200 years. Here the legend has to be taken apart, because it is one of the most durable things ever said about her, and it is largely untrue. The picture of a queen in a straw hat, dressed as a milkmaid, playing at peasants with a ribboned crook while France went hungry, is very substantially a 19th century embellishment. The hameau was a working farm. It had a head farmer, a man named Valley Boussard, and livestock and fields, and a dairy that produced, and what it produced went to the royal table. The ornamental farm was a Europe-wide aristocratic fashion of exactly those decades. There were versions of it in England, in the German states, in Italy, and a good half of the great families of France were building them. That is the correction, and it is a real one. Here is the other half of it, and no amount of context makes it smaller. It cost an immense amount of money, and it was built in the years when the French state was borrowing in order to pay the interest on money it had already borrowed. The people admitted behind the hedge were few, and they became famous for it. First, the Princesse de Lamballe, gentle, devoted, not clever, appointed superintendent of the Queen's household in 1774 at a salary that scandalized the court. Then Yolande de Polastron, Duchesse de Polignac, who displaced her almost entirely, a woman of real charm and modest fortune, whose family proceeded to draw offices, governorships, pensions, and a dowry settlement out of the crown at a rate that became a national grievance in its own right. There is no honest way to describe this except as the Queen's doing. She loved a friend, and she paid for the friendship out of the public revenue of France, and she went on doing it for a decade. It was indefensible, it was resented, and the resentment was correct, and then, on the 24th of October 1784, she bought a palace. The Château de Saint-Cloud was purchased from the Duc d'Orléans for 6 million livres, and the sum was not the worst of it. It was bought in her name. Notices went up around the estate announcing regulations by order of the Queen, and educated France read them with something close to disbelief, because a Queen of France did not own palaces and did not issue orders. Queens of France were consorts. The property of the crown belonged to the king, and the king's orders were the only orders there were. What looked to her like a house in clean air, where the children could be got out of Versailles, looked to the political nation like a foreign woman establishing a separate household with a separate revenue and a separate authority on French ground. This is the mechanism of the catastrophe, and it is worth being exact about, because it is not the mechanism people usually assume. She was not hated for being idle. There had been idle queens before, and nobody wrote pamphlets about them. She was hated because a French court existed for one purpose, to allow several thousand families to be seen standing near their sovereign. And she had stopped letting them. A duke whose grandfather had held the candle at the king's coucher found that he could not get himself invited to a small house a mile down a private road where a theatre was being run for people he regarded as nobodies. There was no appeal because there was nothing to appeal to. So he went home to his province, having lost the one thing his rank was actually for. And he talked. His neighbours listened and repeated it, and improved it in the repeating. The pamphlets did not invent that anger. They found it lying ready in every provincial drawing-room in France and sold it back. They gave the place names too. Little Vienna, they called it. Little Schönbrunn. The charge being that the Queen had built herself a piece of Austria inside France and shut the door. It was a cheap accusation, and it was not true in any literal sense whatsoever. It worked perfectly. She had done something that no Queen of France had ever done, and she had done it almost without noticing. She had built a place where she could not be seen. A house behind a wood at the end of a private road, with a gate and a rule of entry that had nothing to do with birth and everything to do with whether she found you amusing. And for a woman who had been undressed by strangers at 14 and watched by 2 governments ever since, It must have felt like the first free air she had breathed in France. It was also, politically, the single most expensive mistake of her life. Because Versailles was not a residence. Versailles was a stage built by a king who understood that power which is not seen is not believed in, and its whole enormous machinery existed so that the nobility of France could stand in a room and watch their sovereigns eat. She had walked off the stage and closed the door. And the 4,000 people left standing on the wrong side of it went home and told each other what they imagined was happening in there. Within 5 years, in the cellars and back rooms of Paris, and in printing houses in London and Amsterdam beyond the reach of French law, other people were writing it down and selling it. And the country was ready to believe every word. Almost everything in the pamphlets was invented. The rest of this chapter is about the part that was not. Because a libel does not need to be true to sell. It needs somewhere to stand. She gave them somewhere to stand. Here are the true stories. In the summer of 1774, within weeks of becoming queen, she took up a marchande de mode from Picardy. Rose Bertin kept a shop in the Rue Saint-Honoré called the Grand Mogul, built the first true luxury fashion house in Europe out of the Queen's custom, and was received privately in the Queen's own apartments twice a week. At Versailles, the right to hand a queen her shift was fought over by duchesses for generations. Here was a tradeswoman walking in by appointment with sketches. The court called her the Minister of Fashion, not an office and not a compliment. The hair was the other half of it. Léonard Autier dressed the Queen's head, and in the later 1770s the poof went up. Not a hairstyle, but a construction of pads, wire, false hair, and powder dressed with feathers, ribbons, and, on occasion, objects. A foot to 2 feet was usual. Enough to make a carriage interior a problem of engineering. The celebrated 3-foot version comes from a reproof Maria Theresa wrote in March 1775, reporting it as hearsay and measuring from the roots. Then one of them went to sea. On the 17th of June 1778, the frigate Belle Poule fought the British Arethusa off the Breton coast in the opening exchange of France's American War, a day whose wider fighting was indecisive. Within weeks the court was wearing a model warship in its hair. The style is credited to the Queen's hairdresser. No portrait shows that she ever wore it herself. It made no difference. It was hers by association. She gambled too. Faro and lansquenet, the fast games, at stakes that were not decorative, with professional players brought from Paris to fill the tables, which was not done. One session ran through a day and a night, and into the day after, long past the hour the king set. She lost heavily, and the debts were settled quietly out of the treasury. Now the arithmetic, where most accounts of her lose either their nerve or their honesty. Her clothing allowance was 120,000 livres a year, and she routinely spent more than double it. In 1776, something like 100,000 went on accessories alone. That same year, she took a pair of diamond bracelets priced at 250,000, could not pay, went on installments, traded in other jewels against the balance, the rest covered by her husband. 8 years later, Saint-Cloud for 6 million. Set that beside the country. A labourer in Paris earned 25 to 30 sous a day. There were 20 sous to the livre. A 4-pound loaf cost 9 sous in August 1788. Bread alone normally took half of what a working man brought home, and by the spring of 1789 close to 88% of it. That is one truth, and it is not negotiable. Here is the other, and it is the correction this film owes her. The ruin of French public finance was not the work of a queen's dressmaker. Her share of the court was the part that could be seen. The arithmetic that broke the monarchy was done elsewhere, in offices she was never admitted to. France entered the American Revolutionary War in 1778 and fought it for 5 years at a cost on the order of 1.33 billion livres, and Jacques Necker paid for almost none of it out of taxation. He borrowed it. By the later 1780s, servicing that debt alone consumed more than half of everything the government took in each year. No reliable total exists. Estimates vary by a factor of 3. Both things are true. Neither cancels the other. Only one of them fitted on a pamphlet. Necker supplied the last ingredient himself. In February 1781, he published the Compte Rendu au Roi, a statement of the royal finances printed and sold to the public, the first of its kind in French history. It was a bestseller and misleading because it left the war's extraordinary expenditure out of the reckoning and showed a surplus where there was a deficit. A nation that has learned to read a budget has learned how to read a scandal. The scandal was already in production. The trade in libels was illegal, cheap, and enormously profitable. Written by hacks in London and Amsterdam, beyond the reach of French law, smuggled over the frontier in bales, sold under counters at prices a clerk could afford. They went after the Queen rather than the King for a purely practical reason. To libel the King of France was treason. To libel his wife was merely obscene. The categories were adultery, relations with women, incest and treason on behalf of Austria, and this film will name them and stop there. The content was pornographic, manufactured, and reproducing it does that trade's work. Robert Darnton judges that the defamation aimed at her has few parallels in the history of vilification. The proportions are what people get wrong. Before 1789, only about 1/10 of that literature took the Queen as its subject. Afterwards, most of it did. It sat in cellars and in memory for 8 years, until a prosecutor picked it up and read it aloud in a courtroom. The charges she answered at the end of her life were the pamphlets of the middle of it, with an official signature at the bottom. Nor could she escape by spending less. In 1783, Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun showed her at the Salon in a plain, unhooped muslin gown of the kind she wore at Trianon, and the outcry took the picture down. The name arrived in the warm months of 1787. Madame Déficit. The story fastened to it that the Vigée-Lebrun portrait of the Queen with her children was held back from that year's Salon for fear of demonstrations, and that somebody pinned a paper reading there is the deficit to the empty frame, is repeated everywhere and documented nowhere. The name was already in circulation. There is a cradle in that painting, and it is empty. Why it is empty belongs to a later chapter. And here, precisely here, is the thing this film exists to say. She never said the sentence, not in French, not in any version of it, not to anybody. Nobody accused her of it in 1789, when they accused her of everything else. Nobody raised it at her trial, where they used material far more inventive. It was fastened to her name in print by a journalist 2 generations after she was dead, and how that happened is the last thing this film will come to. The reason it took is written above. 100 true stories had got there first. The bracelets were real. The gambling was real. Saint-Cloud was real. And bread cost what bread cost. A country that knows those things about its queen will take one more in the same shape. The lie never had to be plausible. It only had to rhyme. Madame Déficit came in 1787. The trap it named was finished 3 years earlier. By the summer of 1784, the trap was fully built, and she had helped to build it. Whatever she did now would be read as evidence. If she spent, she was ruining France. If she economized, she was mean. If she wore diamonds, she was Madame Déficit. And if she wore muslin, she was insulting the silk weavers of Lyon and appearing before her subjects in her underclothes. There was no longer any action available to her that could not be turned into a story. And in that same summer, two things happened, a few miles apart, that she knew nothing whatsoever about. In a workshop in Paris, a jeweler who had spent a dozen years trying to sell a diamond necklace to somebody, anybody, was close to ruin and had begun to talk to intermediaries. And in a rented room in Versailles, a woman of 28 who had grown up begging on a road in Champagne, who could prove her descent from a king of France, and who had spent her whole life being told that she should have been somebody, sat down with a man who could copy handwriting. Neither of them had ever met the Queen. It made no difference at all. She was innocent. That has to be said at the front rather than the end, because what follows is an extremely good story, and good stories have a way of outliving the corrections attached to them. She did not order the necklace. She never saw it. She never held it, never wore it, never signed for it, never wrote a line of the letters that were carried around Paris in what people were assured was her handwriting, and never on any night of her life met the Cardinal de Rohan in a garden after dark. She had been offered the thing more than once and had refused it more than once. When the fraud came apart, she was as astonished as anybody in France, and rather slower than most of them to grasp what it was going to do to her. And she was never charged. That is the detail that finished her. A person who is never accused in a courtroom can never be cleared in one, and the country convicted her anyway, in the only court that turned out to matter. Now the story. The object had been built for a mistress who was about to lose her protector on the commission, or possibly only on the speculation of two men who badly wanted a commission. The sources divide. Of a king who by then had been 10 years in his tomb. Charles Boehmer and Paul Bassange had spent years buying stones across Europe for it. 647 diamonds, somewhere near 2,800 carats. A rivière, a river of light meant to lie flat across the collarbones, with festoons swagged down over the breast and two heavy tassels hanging from them. Almost nobody who saw it called it beautiful. They called it enormous. The jewelers had asked 2 million livres. After Louis XV died and Madame du Barry was sent away from court, they dropped the price to 1,600,000, and there it stayed, unsold, for a decade, while the two men who owned it slid steadily towards ruin. Here is what that figure meant to the people who would shortly be reading about it in the street. A Paris labourer earned 25 to 30 sous a day, and there were 20 sous in a livre. The necklace was worth something over 1 million days of a working man's life, the entire annual earnings of about 3,500 Parisian labourers laid end to end, in a decade when bread alone was taking half of what such a man brought home. Twice it had been offered to the Queen, and twice she had said no. The reason she is supposed to have given, that France had more need of ships than of diamonds, is reported rather than documented, and belongs with the remarks that are too neat to trust. The refusal itself is not in doubt. She did not want it. Almost nobody has ever heard that. Two other people had been watching the jeweller's desperation with close attention. Jeanne de Valois-Saint-Rémy was descended, genuinely, from a king of France, through a bastard line of the Valois that had been shedding land and money for 200 years. She had been found as a child begging on a road in Champagne, was granted a small pension once her descent was verified, and had married a soldier who called himself a count. She had nerve, charm, an excellent memory for what people wanted to hear, and a grievance the exact size of her ancestry. Cardinal Louis de Rohan was the other half of the mechanism. Grand Almoner of France, Bishop of Strasbourg, Prince of one of the greatest houses in Europe, and as ambassador to Vienna in the early 1770s, a man who had offended Maria Theresa so comprehensively that her daughter had not spoken a civil word to him since. He was rich, vain, credulous, and desperate to be forgiven. He wanted the Queen's favour more than he wanted anything on earth, and he had wanted it so openly for so long that anybody in France could have found the lever. Jeanne found it, and worked it for 18 months. The method was letters. They arrived in a small, sloping hand that was not the Queen's, on gilt-edged paper, and they warmed by careful degrees. Acknowledgement, then interest, then confidence, then a tone that a churchman of 50 read as something more, because he wished to. They were written by a man named Rétaux de Villette, who could copy anything, and who confessed to all of it afterwards. And on the night of the 11th of August 1784, they showed him the Queen herself. A young woman named Nicole Leguay d'Oliva, hired for a resemblance, she had been told, was flattering, dressed in a plain white muslin gown of the sort Marie Antoinette had been painted in and mocked for, was walked into the Grove of Venus at Versailles late at night and left standing among the trees. The cardinal came. It was dark. She gave him a rose, said a few words that the accounts do not agree on, and was hurried away before he could say very much back. He believed for the next year and a half that he had met the Queen of France in a wood, and he told people so. Then there were the papers. He was shown the contract of sale with the word approuvé written in the margin against each clause, and at the foot of it a signature, Marie Antoinette de France. There was no such person. The royal family of France signed with the baptismal name, and nothing else. No house, no territory, no kingdom. It was among the oldest rules at that court, one of the 10,000 pieces of etiquette drilled into a barely literate girl of 14 in the months after she crossed the Rhine, by tutors who had begun with her handwriting because her handwriting had been the worst of it. She signed herself Marie Antoinette. She had signed herself Marie Antoinette on every document she had touched in France for 15 years. And in her case, the forgery was doubly impossible because she was a Habsburg-Lorraine archduchess who had been married into the French royal house and had never been of France for a single day of her life. Louis XVI saw it instantly. By Madame Campin's account, when the papers were finally laid in front of him, he asked how a prince of the House of Rohan, a man born inside that etiquette, raised at that court, holding the office of Grand Almoner of the kingdom, could possibly have believed that the Queen of France signed herself Marie Antoinette de France. That is the most damning fact in the whole affair, and it belongs to the king. A shy, short-sighted, slow-spoken man glanced at a sheet of paper and knew it was a forgery in the time it took to read 4 words. The most senior churchman of his household, who had staked his career and a great part of his fortune on it, had been looking at the same 4 words for a year and had seen nothing wrong with them at all. The rest went quickly. On the 1st of February 1785, Rohan took delivery of the necklace and handed it over that same evening, in a lodging at Versailles, to a man he had been told was the Queen's servant. It was Rétaux. Within days the thing had been prized apart on a table. Within weeks the stones were being sold off in Paris and carried across to London by Jeanne's husband, in quantities large enough to make the dealers uneasy and small enough to keep them quiet. The most expensive object in France stopped existing about a fortnight after it was finally sold, and not one of the people who bought a piece of it is recorded as ever having known what they had. Boehmer waited for a payment that never came, panicked, and approached the Queen through her household with a letter of thanks so incomprehensible that, by Campan's account, which is the only one there is, she read it, made nothing of it, and burned it. Then on the 15th of August, 1785, the Feast of the Assumption, the Grand Almoner of France, stood vested for Mass before the whole court, was called aside, was questioned in front of the King and Queen, and was arrested. He was still in his pontifical robes when they walked him out through the Hall of Mirrors. Her own question to him that day survives, again through Campan, and it is colder than anything a narrator could put in its place. How, monsieur, could you have believed, you to whom I have not addressed a word in 8 years, that I would choose you to negotiate anything at all for me, and above all, through the mediation of a woman I do not even know? And then the king made the worst decision of his reign to that point. He could have dealt with a fraud committed against his wife's name inside his own household, quietly, on his own authority, which in such a matter was still absolute. Instead, he offered Rohan a choice, and Rohan chose to be tried by the Parlement of Paris, a court that had spent 20 years in open conflict with the Crown, and which was now handed as a gift 9 months of public proceedings on the question of whether the Queen of France met cardinals in gardens at midnight. She did not appear. She could not. She was not a party to it. She sat at Versailles while the most sensational trial of the century took her private character apart in a room she was not permitted to enter, and while the pamphlet trade printed something new about it every week. On the 31st of May, 1786, the Parlement acquitted the cardinal completely. It acquitted Deliver. It acquitted the occultist Cagliostro, who had been swept up with the rest. It convicted Jeanne de la Motte alone, who was publicly whipped, branded on the shoulder with a V for volus, thief, and shut up for life in the Salpêtrière, and who escaped the following June, dressed as a boy, reached London, and spent her 4 remaining years publishing versions in which all of it had been the Queen's idea. Madame Campan found her mistress alone that afternoon and wrote down what she said. "Come and pity your Queen, insulted and made the victim of cabals and injustice, but in my turn I shall pity you as a Frenchwoman. If I have not found equitable judges in an affair that touched my character, what can you expect if you had a lawsuit that touched your fortune and your honour?" She had understood the verdict faster than her ministers did. Napoleon, long afterwards, is supposed to have said much the same thing in fewer words, that the Queen's death ought to be dated from the necklace trial. The wording shifts with the telling. The judgment has never been much improved on. On the 31st of May, 1786, the Parlement of Paris acquitted the Cardinal de Rohan, and the crowd outside the Palais de Justice, thousands of them, waiting in the street since morning, cheered him all the way to the Bastille, and then all the way out of it. Fishwives threw flowers. And in the Queen's apartment at Versailles, a woman of 30, who had done nothing whatsoever wrong, who had never met the Cardinal in a garden, never written a line of those letters, never laid a finger on those diamonds, sat and wept in front of her ladies because she had just understood what the verdict actually meant. It was not a judgment about a cardinal. 12 of the most senior judges in France had been asked to decide whether it was believable that the Queen of France would meet a prince of the church at midnight in a wood to arrange the secret purchase of a diamond necklace, and they had answered that it was. Not that it happened, that it was the sort of thing that happened. She had never been accused, so she could never be cleared. The necklace itself had been broken up 18 months earlier, and was, by then, scattered across 2 capitals, in the settings of women whose names nobody has ever recorded. It no longer existed. It did not need to. The story existed, and the story was the only thing that had ever mattered. While France argued in open court about whether its queen bought diamonds in gardens at midnight, another life was going on inside the same building, and nobody was looking at it. She had 4 children. Their names and dates are worth setting down slowly, because here the dates do the work, adjectives cannot. Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, called Madame Royale, born on the 19th of December, 1778. Louis-Joseph Xavier François, Dauphin of France, born on the 22nd of October, 1781. Louis Charles, born on the 27th of March, 1785. Sophie Hélène Béatrix, born on the 9th of July, 1786. 2 of them were dead before the Revolution began. The first of those births nearly killed her, and it did so in the most precisely Versailles manner available. It was watched. Under the custom of that court, the birth of a child of France was a constitutional act, not a private one. A royal child had to be seen to be born of that mother in that room, so that no substitution could afterwards be alleged. On the 19th of December, 1778, word went round the palace that the Queen's labour had begun, and the corridors emptied into her bedchamber. What happened next comes down chiefly through Madame Campan, who was in the room and wrote it out 40 years afterwards. The essentials are not disputed. The chamber filled and went on filling until people were standing on the furniture. It was December, the windows were sealed against the cold, and the air gave out. As the child was delivered, the Queen convulsed and lost consciousness, and for some minutes a crowd of courtiers stood watching what they took to be the Queen of France, dying in front of them. The King forced the windows open himself. She was 23 years old. It was her first child, and she had had it in front of a crowd. Louis XVI abolished the custom. His later children were born before the family, the physicians, and a few officers of state. It came far too late to matter. The principle had been settled already, not in law, but in the mind of a country. This woman's body was a public place. The court had been present at her wedding night. It had discussed her failure to conceive by diplomatic dispatch for 7 years. It had now stood on her furniture to watch her give birth. Everything later manufactured about her was built on ground prepared here by people who believed they were observing a harmless old ceremony. The child was a girl. The succession was still open, and the country said so. 3 years later, on the 22nd of October, 1781, she was delivered of a son, and this time the guns fired. Paris celebrated for the better part of a week, and the trade guilds are recorded coming out to Versailles in procession. For a few months, she was genuinely popular. There is a cruelty in that timing. She was forgiven at last for the one failure of her life that had never been hers, at almost exactly the moment she was becoming unforgivable for things that partly were. Louis Charles arrived on the 27th of March, 1785, less than 2 months after a cardinal handed a locked casket of diamonds in the dark to a man he had been assured was the Queen's servant. She was in the last weeks of that pregnancy while the fraud was run a few hundred yards away, and knew nothing of it. What kind of mother she was is one of the few questions on which the witnesses agree. Madame Campan, who served her for 20 years, and the Duchesse de Tourzel, who took charge of the royal children at the end, both describe a woman involved with them to a degree the court thought eccentric, who kept them near her, sat up with them through their illnesses, and touched them in public. Both were servants defending a dead mistress, but nothing in the ambassador's reports contradicts them. Sophie Beatrix lived 11 months. She died on the 19th of June, 1787. Her mother's grief is documented, and it was thought excessive. Quietly, by people who held that a queen ought to be able to bury an infant without disarranging the calendar. Royal women lost children and were expected to do it with composure. She did not. Elisabeth Vigée. Lebrun had been commissioned to paint the Queen with her children, and the picture was a political instrument from the first sketch, an answer to the necklace and to a decade of pamphlets. Not the woman in the grove at midnight, a mother in red velvet in a French palace, her family gathered against her. It was designed with 4 children in it. Sophie died while it was being finished, and the infant was taken out of the cradle at the edge of the composition. And the cradle left exactly where it stood, empty, its cover drawn back, the Dauphin's hand on the rail, and his face turned towards it. The canvas was held back from the Salon of 1787 at first, because the court feared a demonstration in front of it, and the story goes that somebody pinned a paper to the empty frame where it should have hung. Voilà le déficit. There is the deficit. It cannot be firmly documented, and the nickname was current that summer already. The picture was hung in the end. It changed nothing at all. By then the boy beside the cradle was ill. Louis Joseph had tuberculosis of the spine, Pott's disease, in which the vertebrae collapse and the back deforms, and against which the 18th century could do nothing. He was put into an iron brace. One shoulder rose above the other. He was moved to Meudon for the air, and across 2 years became a small bent figure, carried everywhere. He was dying, in other words, through precisely the months in which the French state went bankrupt in public. Calonne's Assembly of Notables opened on the 22nd of February 1787 and refused him his taxes. Calonne fell, Brienne followed and failed. Necker was recalled in August 1788, and the Crown, out of money and out of options, summoned the Estates General for May 1789, the first since 1614. In the first week of May he was carried on to a balcony and propped on cushions to watch it open, while the deputies of 3 orders processed below him towards a hall where they would spend 6 weeks refusing to sit as ordered. He was taken back to Meudon. His mother was with him for much of that last month. He died in the early hours of the 4th of June, 1789. He was 7 years old. The days that followed were given to nobody to grieve in. The king shut himself away and would not do business, while the deputies of the Third Estate pressed for their audience regardless. A bitter remark is often quoted from those days, a question about whether there were any fathers among the deputies. It belongs to the king rather than to her. It rests on thin sourcing, and it is not quite fair to the record. When Jean-Sylvain Bailly spoke for the Third Estate on the 6th of June, the boy's death was acknowledged. They buried the Dauphin at Saint-Denis on the 12th of June, 1789, without ceremony, because a court in the middle of a constitutional crisis could not afford a week of mourning. His father did not attend. Kings of France did not attend funerals. His mother was 33 years old and had now buried 2 of her 4 children, and there exists no letter, no journal entry, no reliable account of anything she said about it, because in the first fortnight of June 1789, nobody in France was writing down what the Queen felt. On the 20th of June, 16 days after the boy died, the deputies of the Third Estate found the door of their hall locked and guarded, and went instead to an indoor tennis court in a side street in Versailles, and stood on the floor with their hands raised, and swore that they would not separate until France had a constitution. It was raining. The Dauphin had been dead for a little over 2 weeks, and in the whole enormous palace at the top of the hill, with its 4,000 rooms and its 2,000 courtiers and its machinery for making the smallest gesture of a monarch visible to the entire world, nobody had the leisure to notice which of those 2 events had ended it. It began with the weather, In the summer of 1788, a freak hailstorm crossed the grain provinces of northern France and flattened the standing crop across an enormous stretch of country in a single afternoon. The winter that followed was the coldest in 80 years. The mills stood still on frozen water, the roads closed, and the price of a loaf climbed all through the spring of 1789, until, by the first week of July, a labouring man in Paris was spending the greater part of a day's wage on bread, and bread was very nearly the whole of what a labouring man in Paris ate. That is the fact underneath everything that follows, not the philosophy and not the pamphlets, and not even the American War and the debt it left behind. Those explain why the state was insolvent. The hail explains why the city came out of doors. On the 11th of July, 1789, the king dismissed Jacques Necker, the Genevan banker, whom Paris had persuaded itself was the one man alive capable of feeding it. 3 days later, a crowd went across the city looking for gunpowder and found a fortress that had it, and by the evening of the 14th of July, the Bastille had fallen and its governor was dead in the street. Louis XVI was at Versailles. He was told the following morning. And in his private register, on the line for that day, there is one word: rien. Nothing. It is the most quoted word in French history, and it does not mean what it is used to mean. The book was not a diary, it was a game and engagement register that Louis XVI had kept since he was 11 years old, in which rien was the entry for a day with no kill and no appointment worth recording, as it had been on the 8th of that same July, and the 9th and the 13th, and as it would be again on the 16th, the 18th, and the 21st. The entries for that month were written up afterwards, in August, from daily notes he then destroyed, which means the word was set down by a man who knew perfectly well what had happened on the 14th of July, recording the day's shooting, because that was what the book was for. It is worth stopping on because it is the machinery of this whole story caught in the act. Take a real document, strip the context of it, and you can manufacture a callous king out of a hunting ledger. The identical operation was performed on his wife with a sentence about cake. A sentence she never said in any language to anybody, and with her it worked better because there was no ledger anyone could check. Through the rest of that summer the countryside came apart. Rumours of brigands moving through the provinces set villages arming against an enemy that never arrived, and the armed villages turned instead on the manor houses and burned the muniment rooms where the feudal dues were written down. On the night of the 4th of August, the National Assembly sat until 2 in the morning, while noble after noble rose to surrender his own privileges, and by dawn the legal order of 1,000 years had been abolished by acclamation. 3 weeks after that came the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, and the court began to empty. Within days of the Bastille, the king's younger brother, the Comte d'Artois, was on the road for the frontier, and the Polignacs went with him, Yolande de Polastron, Duchesse de Polignac, governess to the royal children, and the closest friend Marie Antoinette ever had. The Queen appears to have urged her to go. She was hated, and her name was on the lists then circulating in Paris. They did not meet again, but the arithmetic of it was brutal, and every literate person in France could do it. The Queen's favourites had run for the border at the first sign of danger, and the Queen was Austrian, and the border was where Austria was. Then, on the 1st of October, somebody at Versailles decided to give a party. The officers of the Flanders Regiment had been brought up to reinforce the palace guard, and the household gave them a welcome banquet in the opera house. The royal family came in, there was music, healths were drunk to the king. What happened after that is disputed in every particular. The reports that reached Paris within 2 days said that the white cockade of the Bourbon had been passed round the tables, that officers had torn the tricolour from their hats, that it had been trodden underfoot. The details grew with every retelling and cannot now be separated from the invention. The effect is not in doubt for a moment. In a city where women had been standing in line since before dawn for bread that might not come, the papers printed an account of a counter-revolutionary carousal held in a palace at which the Queen had walked among the officers and smiled. On the morning of the 5th of October, the market women of Paris gathered at the Hôtel de Ville, forced the doors, took the weapons they found inside, and set out west along the road to Versailles. 6,000 or 7,000 of them by the usual estimate. Some accounts say 10. It rained all day, and they walked 12 miles in it. Men with pikes and muskets came behind them and among them, and somewhere on the road a court usher named Stanislas Maillard, who had been at the Bastille in July, put himself at their head. They wanted bread. They also wanted the king in Paris, where the city could keep him. Late that night, Lafayette arrived with several thousand of the National Guard, not to stop them, since he had already discovered that he could not, but because his own men had insisted on going. The king received a deputation and agreed to everything. Grain out of the royal stores, the decrees signed without further argument. Some time after 2 in the morning, the palace went cautiously to bed. A little before 6, somebody found a gate that had not been secured. The crowd came through it into the Cour de Marbre and up the staircase toward the Queen's apartments, and 2 of her bodyguards died in the way of it, Jean-François Paget Desouttes, called Deschutes, and François Rouff de Varicourt. Both were killed and beheaded, and their heads went to Paris that afternoon on pikes at the head of the column. Their names are worth keeping. The second of them held the antechamber door long enough to shout a warning through it, and that shout is the only reason there is anything further to tell. She woke to it and ran, barefoot, with 2 of her women, along the narrow private passage that ran from her rooms to the king's, and found the door at the far end bolted, and beat on it until it opened. Behind her, the people coming into the room she had just left found the bed empty. By 9 the courtyard was packed, and the shouting had resolved itself into a single word: Paris. Lafayette brought the king out onto the balcony, and the king agreed to go. Then they called for the Queen. She came out with her son and her daughter, and voices below shouted that they wanted her alone. So she put the children back through the window, and came out again by herself, and stood in front of several thousand people who had spent the night calling for her death, and folded her hands, and bowed her head, and waited. There was a silence that every account of that morning remarks upon. Then Lafayette crossed the balcony, took her hand and kissed it, and somewhere below a few voices began calling out for the Queen, and were taken up. She was 33 years old. Whatever is to be said about her judgment, and a great deal remains to be said, that was the bravest recorded act of her life to that point, and she performed it in front of the people most likely to kill her. Of that night and that morning she said afterwards, "The line is attested, and it is very nearly the whole of her recorded verdict on it. J'ai tout vu, j'ai tout su, et j'ai tout oublié. I have seen everything, known everything, and forgotten everything. Whether that was forgiveness or exhaustion or policy is not something the surviving evidence can settle. They left at about 1 in the afternoon, and the journey took 9 hours to cover 12 miles because the crowd would not go faster and did not want to. Ahead of the carriages walked men carrying loaves of bread on the points of their pikes, and behind them, in the ranks, other men carrying other things. And the wagons of the National Guard came along at the back, full of the flour that had been seized out of the palace stores. The The family reached Paris at dusk. They were taken first to the Hôtel de Ville to be shown to the city, and then, late that night, to the Tuileries, a palace which no French king had lived in for 104 years, unheated, unfurnished, partitioned by squatters and thick with dust, where the beds had to be found and made up after midnight. The Dauphin, who was 4, looked around the rooms and asked why everything was so ugly here. His mother told him that Louis XIV had lived there and had thought it very fine, and that they must not be more particular than he was. She was 33 years old. She had lived in France for 19 years, and she had just left Versailles for the last time. So had everybody else. The doors were locked behind them that October, and the beds have been empty ever since. The Tuileries were not a prison, and that was the whole difficulty with them. The king was still king. He signed, he received, he heard mass. The family walked in a garden any citizen could enter, and the citizens came in and watched. Nobody had been charged with anything. Nobody was going anywhere. It was a captivity calibrated so exactly that everyone involved could go on calling it something else. And inside it, for the first time in her life, Marie Antoinette went to work. She was 34. What she had done before 1789 was patronage dressed as statecraft. This was different. She learned to cipher, ran couriers to Brussels and to Vienna, and for 2 years conducted a private foreign policy her husband did not so much authorize as failed to prevent. She was not good at it, no training, no accurate picture of what France now thought, no ability to imagine a settlement in which the crown got less than everything. But she was the only person in that building doing anything, and the ablest politician in France noticed and wrote it down. Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Comte de Mirabeau, was the greatest orator the Revolution produced and the least respectable man in French public life, and the only man then alive who understood both what the Revolution had made irreversible and what a king might still be worth to it. From May 1790, he was in the court's secret pay, 208,000 livres of debt cleared, a retainer after it, and a fortune promised if the monarchy survived. He and the Queen met exactly once at Saint-Cloud on the 3rd of July 1790. She did not trust him. She wrote of the horror his immorality inspired in her. Then he sent the court the sentence that hangs over everything after it. Le roi n'a qu'un homme, c'est sa femme. The king has only one man about him, and that is his wife. It is quoted as a compliment. It is not one. It is a verdict on Louis XVI. In that household, exactly one person could reach a decision and hold to it, and she was a foreign queen who could not be seen to govern. Mirabeau died on the 2nd of April 1791, aged 42. She had distrusted the only serious ally the monarchy had, and he was dead 9 months after she met him. There was no French plan left after him, only a foreign one. Its author was a Swede. Axel von Fersen had met her at a masked ball in Paris in January 1774, when both were 18 and she was not yet queen. For 2 decades, he was a fixture of her circle. After 1789, he became the one capable man near her who was not French and wanted nothing the Revolution could take away. He planned the escape and paid for much of it. What the two of them were to each other has been argued over for 2 centuries across evidence somebody deliberately spoiled. In the 19th century, their letters were gone over with a heavy pen and whole lines blotted out. In 2021, a team led by Anne Michelin read them anyway, by macro X-ray fluorescence, mapping the metals in the inks straight through the censor's scribble. Of 15 redacted letters, they recovered 8, written between June 1791 and August 1792. Underneath were the words beloved and tender friend and adore and madly, and the phrase non pas sans vous, not without you. The censoring ink was Fersen's own. It establishes an intense emotional intimacy running both ways through the worst year of her life. It establishes nothing about whether they were lovers, and neither does anything else that survives. There is no proof in either direction. They had reasons to run. In October, a crowd had come through an unbolted gate at Versailles and killed 2 of her bodyguards outside her door. She had buried 2 of her 4 children. She had every reason to believe that the next time no balcony and no kissed hand would be enough. But the plan was a bad one, and a fair share of what was wrong with it was hers. Fersen wanted 2 light carriages travelling separately and fast. The king and queen would not divide the family. So what left Paris was a berline, new, large enough for 6, with a folding table and a silver service, drawn by 6 horses where a post-chaise took 2, and slow on every rise. It was the most conspicuous vehicle in eastern France. And the king meant to reach Montmédy recognizable, and to be received there as a king. They left about midnight on the 20th of June, 1791, crossing the courtyard in 1s and 2s. Passports were made out for the household of the Baronne de Korff, a real Russian noblewoman. The Duchesse de Tourzel travelled as the Baroness, Marie Antoinette as her children's governess, the King of France as a valet, and Louis Charles, who was 6, was dressed as a girl. Fersen drove them out of the city on the box in a coachman's coat and handed over at Bondy in the first light. After that they lost time all day in the way heavy coaches on hot roads do, and the escort chain came apart from the far end backwards. At Pont de Sommevail, the Duc de Choiseul waited for a coach that did not come, concluded the whole thing had been abandoned, and withdrew his detachment. The best-known account of the escort's collapse rests on a memoir historians treat as a fabrication. At Saint-Menehould, the postmaster, Jean-Baptiste Drouet, looked into the coach and thought he knew the face, plausibly from the assignats, the Revolution's paper money, which carried the king's portrait. He rode ahead across country. At Varennes-en-Argonne, 30 miles short of the fortress they were making for, the road was blocked and the berlines stopped late on the night of the 21st of June. They were put in the rooms above a grocer's shop. Asked directly, the king said that he was the king. The town sat up all night as a garrison. In the morning, the order came from Paris. What the flight destroyed was not the escape. It was the last fiction holding the settlement together. Louis XVI had left behind a declaration in his own hand repudiating almost everything he had agreed to since 1789. The Assembly announced that the king had been abducted, and the country did not believe a word of it. From that week, republicanism became a mass position. On the 17th of July, a crowd of some 50,000 gathered on the Champ de Mars around a petition to depose him. Bailly declared martial law, and Lafayette's National Guard fired into them. How many died, there has never been established. In September, the king accepted the Constitution, and nobody believed him. All of it followed from 4 days on a road in June. They came back into Paris on the evening of the 25th of June through the Champs-Élysées in a coach so slow that the journey of 150 miles had taken 4 days under an escort of 30,000 men. Posters had gone up along the whole route. Whoever applauds the king shall be beaten, whoever insults him shall be hanged, and, so the largest crowd Paris had ever assembled stood along the roads and in the trees and on the rooftops and watched the King of France come home and did not make a sound, but every man in that silence kept his hat on his head. It was a small thing, and it was the end of 1,000 years. Marie Antoinette sat inside the coach with her son on her knee and her daughter beside her, and by the accounts of those who saw her come out of it at the Tuileries, she had aged years in a week. The hair at her temples, which had been fair, had gone white. She had helped plan the escape. The coach had been her idea of comfort, and the refusal to divide the family had been her condition. She had, in one night, converted a constitutional monarchy into a hostage situation and confirmed for every Frenchman who had ever muttered the word Autrichienne that the Queen would run to the border the moment she got the chance. 9 months later, France declared war on her own family in Vienna. And on that day, everything she had ever done for Austria stopped being a scandal and became a capital crime. Everybody in France wanted that war, and every one of them wanted it for a different reason. On the 20th of April 1792, Louis XVI asked the Legislative Assembly to declare war on Austria, formally on her nephew, the King of Hungary, and Bohemia, her brother Leopold having died in March. The king expected France to lose, and a beaten France would have to send for its king. And the Queen wanted it, and worked for it. This is where the defence stops. Over the months that followed, she passed information to the enemies of the country she had lived in for 22 years, not gossip. In the spring of 1792, she conveyed to the Austrian ambassador the general shape of the French plan of campaign, the intended thrust into the Austrian Netherlands before the columns moved, and she pressed continually in cipher for foreign intervention. The letters are in Vienna, and modern historians accept the substance of it. Call it what it was. That was treason, not by the standard of the tribunal that would later convict her of things she had never done, but by any standard available in any century in wartime. Thousands of French soldiers died in that war. Two things can be said, and neither is a defence. Historians differ over whether it did measurable damage. Vienna had other sources, and the 1792 offensive collapsed within days. And she did not experience it as betrayal. She had been handed across a river at 14 as the seal on an Austrian alliance, and nobody had ever asked her to become French. She believed a foreign army was the only thing that would get her children out of Paris alive. Both of those women were the same woman. On the 20th of June, a Paris crowd came into the Tuileries and kept the king in a window bay for 2 hours in a red cap, drinking to the health of the nation. She was penned behind the council table with her children while the column filed past to look at her. Nobody was killed. It was a rehearsal. 5 weeks later, the Duke of Brunswick published a manifesto drafted by émigrés. If the smallest violence were offered to the king or the queen, Paris would be destroyed. It was meant to protect them. No document has ever worked more precisely in reverse. Until then, they had been a constitutional problem, hostages of a kind. Afterwards, they were the reason a foreign general had promised to burn the city, no longer prisoners, but enemy agents, with an army marching towards them. The tocsins began before midnight on the 9th of August. Next morning, the family walked across the garden to the riding school where the assembly sat and spent the day in the reporter's box while the palace was taken. The king sent an order in for the Swiss Guard to cease fire, and they obeyed it. Of some 800 Swiss in Paris that morning, about 200 were alive that night. The monarchy was suspended that evening. On the 13th of August, they were taken to the Temple. It was the walled precinct of the old Knights Templar in the Marais, and they were moved into the medieval keep at the centre of it that autumn, behind a new wall with a sentry on every landing. On the 19th of August, the attendants who had followed them in were driven away to La Force, among them the Princesse de Lamballe, who had come back from safety in England to rejoin her. 2 weeks later, Verdun fell, and the city persuaded itself the jails were full of men waiting to cut its throat. Between the 2nd and the 6th of September, the crowds went into the prisons and killed between 1,400 and 2,000 people. The Princess de Lamballe was murdered at La Force on the 3rd of September, having refused to swear an oath of hatred against the king and the monarchy. Her head was carried through the streets on a pike, and the crowd brought it towards the temple. What everyone has heard next did not happen. She was not shown it and did not see it. The officers on duty shut the gates and kept the crowd out, and the famous scene at the window belongs to the literature rather than the record. She was told afterwards that her friend was dead. On the 21st of September, the convention abolished the monarchy and the family acquired a surname, Capet. Louis XVI was tried in December, convicted almost without dissent, and condemned to death by a narrow margin. They saw him on the evening of the 20th of January for 2 hours behind a glazed door so the guards could watch without hearing. He said he would come again at 7 in the morning. He did not. He left the temple in a closed carriage with the blinds drawn. He was executed at the Place de la Révolution at about 10:15 on the 21st of January, 1793. When he began to speak from the platform, the drums were ordered to beat. Remember the closed carriage, it matters later. In the tower the news came up from the street. She did not come out of her rooms. By the accounts of those who saw her that winter, she was not the woman in the portraits. Gaunt, half-blind in poor light, and white-haired, not overnight, and not at Varennes, whatever the legend says. That spring a former officer called Jarias turned 2 of the temple guards, and a way out was arranged that would have taken her through the door in a lamplighter's coat. She would not go without her son, and her son could not be brought. She wrote to end it in a sentence that is unarguably hers. Nous avons fait un beau rêve, voilà tout. We have had a beautiful dream, and that is all. 23 years earlier, on an island in the Rhine, France had taken everything she owned, so that she should carry nothing of a foreign country into her new one, and that had been an afternoon's work. The Tower did it again, and took a year over it. They took the attendants in August, and the knives and the scissors and the razors after the massacres. The king's valet, whose journal survives, describes shaving his master under the eye of a commissioner. Pen, ink, and paper came and went at the pleasure of the men on duty. They allowed her the black, and told her whom she might wear it for. Not a king, but the citizen Louis Capet, a private man executed for his crimes. There was one thing left. They came for the boy on the night of the 3rd of July with an order from the Committee of Public Safety. He was 8 years old. The only account of what happened in that room was written by his sister, who was 14 and standing in it, that their mother would not give him up, and stood in front of the bed where he was lying, and defended it against the municipal officers, that an hour went by in argument and insult and threat, and that at the end of the hour she gave in, and put her son into the hands of the men who had come for him, bathing him in her tears, as though her daughter wrote she had somehow foreseen that she would never see him again. They put him 2 floors below, in his father's old rooms, in the keeping of a cobbler named Simon. For a few weeks afterwards she found that if she stood on a particular step of the tower staircase at a particular hour, she could sometimes see him being taken out to the leads to take the air, and she went and stood on that step every day. Then they blocked it. On the night of the 1st of August they woke her at 2 in the morning and told her to dress and gather her things. She was taken across Paris in the dark to the Conciergerie, the prison beneath the Palais de Justice, which everybody in France called the antechamber of the guillotine because almost nobody who entered it was ever charged with anything they might survive. They wrote her into the register. She was 37 years old, and from that night she was not a queen, and not a widow, and not a mother, and not even a name. She was a number. The number was 280. It went into the register of the Conciergerie in the small hours of the 2nd of August, 1793. She was there 76 days. They gave her a damp ground-floor room with a barred window and a folding screen across it, and behind the screen, day and night, 2 men whose employment was to look at her. Her possessions were listed and counted. The watch she had carried from Vienna at 14 was taken, and so was the sewing she was allowed, on the reasoning that a needle is a piece of pointed metal. She was bleeding almost continuously, and the prison doctor had nothing for it. She was 37. She had been in France for 23 years. At the end of August, a man with no business there got into that room. Alexandre Goncet de Rougeville, a former royalist officer, brought in behind the police administrator Michonis. He let fall a carnation with a note inside it. The plan collapsed within days, betrayed by one of the guards. She had nothing to write with, so she pricked her reply out with a pin, and it was intercepted. The child whose writing exercises had been traced for her in pencil in Vienna was answering her last offer of rescue by punching holes in paper. She would write once more, in ink, at 4:30 in a particular morning, in a hand that had steadied at last. The plot achieved the reverse of what it intended. Her guard was doubled, and the year-old question of what to do with her, a living queen being worth more traded to Vienna than dead, was settled inside 5 weeks by Ebert and the Paris sections. She was decreed accused on the 3rd of October, and what she is recorded as saying when they told her sets the register for what followed. Ils peuvent être mes bourreaux, mais ils ne seront jamais mes juges. They may be my executioners, but they will never be my judges. The indictment was enormous and reached her on the 12th. Her counsel, Chauveau-Lagarde and Tronçon-Ducoudray, were appointed at the last moment with a few hours to read it. They had her write to the convention asking for 3 days. No answer came. At 8 on the 14th of October she was brought up into the great hall of the Palais de Justice in black before Marshal Hermann and the prosecutor Fouquier-Tinville. Her husband had been tried and killed as Louis Capet. On the court's papers she was the Widow Capet, the last of the confiscations. The charges were intelligence with foreign powers, the export of French money to her brother the Emperor, the domination of her husband, and the debaucheries of Versailles. Anyone literate in 1785 knew that shape at once. The indictment against the Queen of France was, very substantially, the obscene pamphlet trade of the previous decade, with a prosecutor's signature at the bottom. One strand of it was true, and this film has said so plainly. She had corresponded with the enemy in wartime. Fouquier-Tinville could not prove it. His 40-odd witnesses produced hearsay and old court gossip, and he had almost no documents. He did not need any. Then Hébert produced a paper. It had been signed on the 6th of October by Louis Charles, aged 8, taken from his mother 3 months earlier and given into the keeping of a cobbler 2 floors below her, and given drink before he was asked to sign. In it, he accused his mother of sexually abusing him. It was a fabrication built by the men who took it down, who had already tried and failed to have it confirmed by his sister and his aunt. That is all that will be said of its contents. She did not answer it. A question came, and she let it pass, then another. And it was one of the jurors who observed that the accused had not replied to the citizen Hébert. She answered then, and the tribunal's own bulletin printed it. Si je n'ai pas répondu, c'est que la nature se refuse à répondre à une pareille question faite à une mère. If I have not replied, it is because nature itself refuses to answer such a question put to a mother. Then she turned from the bench toward the side of the hall where the women were sitting. J'en appelle à toutes celles qui peuvent se trouver ici. I appeal to all of those who are here. What followed is reported rather than recorded. A noise went through the hall, and order took some restoring. Some of those women had walked 12 miles to Versailles in the rain 4 years before to fetch the king back by force. They had not come to be moved by her. Robespierre, it was said afterwards, was furious with Hébert. That tribunal could not afford to make the Widow Capet sympathetic. For 23 years the interior life of this woman's body had been public administration. Her wedding night at 14 was conducted in front of the court and reported to 3 capitals within the week. The 7 barren years that followed were discussed in cipher by ambassadors. Her mother wrote from Vienna asking after her monthly cycle. She bore her first child in a room so crowded that she lost consciousness. Then a professional industry took the subject over for 20 years. And at the end, unable to prove the treason it was actually trying her for, the Republic reached for the one accusation nobody had made yet. It was never meant to be evidence. It was the last entry on a list that had been open since 1770. And a nation that had spent 23 years discussing this woman's body had run out of other things to accuse it of. Asked at the end whether she had anything to add, she gave the court a defendant's answer rather than a martyr's. In substance, that the day before she had not known the witnesses, that not one person had stated a single positive fact against her, and that she had been only the wife of Louis XVI, obliged to conform to his will. It is in the record, and it is better than the speech she is usually given here. Invented in 1794 by an émigré who was not at the trial. The questions finally put to the jury did not include Hébert's charge. They came back at about 4 in the morning of the 16th of October, guilty on every question, death and confiscation of her property. Asked whether she had anything to say on the penalty, she said nothing. Every account agrees on what she did, which was nothing. She heard it out without moving, then turned and walked back between the benches without looking up. She was taken back down the corridor a little before 5 in the morning, and she asked for a light and for pen and paper, and she sat down on the edge of the bed and wrote to her husband's sister, the woman who was 2 miles away across Paris in the Temple Tower, looking after her daughter. She wrote that she was writing to her sister for the last time. She wrote that she had been condemned not to a shameful death, since that was only for criminals, but to go and rejoin their brother. She asked forgiveness of everyone she had ever known for the trouble she had caused them without meaning to. She wrote about her children and asked her sister to be a mother to them, and, this is the line that gets people 230 years later, she wrote that her son must never seek to avenge them. Then she folded it and gave it to the man on duty because there was nobody else to give it to. It went straight upstairs to the prosecutor. From the prosecutor, it went into a bundle of papers in the lodgings of Maximilien Robespierre, where it stayed until after his own execution 9 months later, when a deputy going through his effects found it and kept it, and did not produce it for 20 years. Madame Elizabeth followed her sister-in-law to the scaffold in May 1794. She never knew the letter existed. It was finally read aloud in public to a chamber of French deputies in February 1816, 22 years, 4 months, and 6 days after it was written, to an audience of men, not one of whom was the person it was addressed to. The last morning began at about 7 o'clock, with a bowl of broth. It was brought by Rosalie Lamorlière, a servant of the conciergerie, and nearly everything known about those hours comes from her, an account taken down from an illiterate woman by a priest 30 years later, the substance accepted, the wording his. She had not slept. When the broth came, she is reported to have said, "Eh bien, Rosalie, apportez-moi votre bouillon. Bring me your broth," and to have managed 2 spoonfuls. Then she asked to change her linen unwatched, and the gendarme who had stood in her room all night would not go. She changed it in the space between the bed and the wall, then folded the used shift small and pushed it into a gap behind the stove because she did not want it handled. Then she dressed in white. The executioner's party came in a little before 11. Her hands were tied behind her back, and only then, with her hands already bound, was her cap taken off and her hair cut away at the neck in the registry room. The order matters. The woman who had been refused 2 minutes of privacy that morning was pinioned in front of a room of men and cropped where she stood. Her hair, by the accounts of those who saw her that year, had gone white. It was already short. Outside stood a cart, not a carriage, but the open tumbril the tribunal used for everybody. Her husband had gone to the same square 9 months earlier in a closed carriage. The difference was not an oversight. It was the point. The journey took the better part of an hour west along the Rue Saint-Honoré to the square that had been called the Place Louis XV on the night in 1770 when 132 people were crushed to death there, celebrating her wedding, and was now the Place de la Révolution. Somewhere along that street, at an upper window, a man drew her as the cart went past, Jacques Louis David, who 9 months earlier, as a deputy of the convention, had voted for her husband's death. The sketch shows a woman upright on a plank with her hands behind her, chin lifted, mouth shut. It is the last likeness of her taken from life. She reached the square a little after noon and went up the steps quickly. On the platform, by a report printed in Paris within weeks, she trod by accident on the executioner's foot and turned to him and said, "Monsieur, je vous demande excuse. Je ne l'ai pas fait exprès." "Sir, I beg your pardon. I did not do it on purpose. That report is not 19th century sentiment. It appears in Révolution de Paris, number 212. A revolutionary paper violently hostile to her, which printed the line as the caption to an etching, and elsewhere sneered that she had staged it. She appears to have made no last speech at all. The only description of her bearing from a named witness is a clause reported that autumn by a man called Lapierre, that she went avec une fermeté incroyable, sans broncher, with incredible firmness, without flinching. At about 12:15 it was over. She was 37 years old. Her body went a few hundred yards to the burial ground of the Madeleine in the Rue d'Anjou, into an unmarked trench with quicklime thrown in after it. Nobody marked the place. Her son outlived her by 20 months. Louis Charles died in the Temple on the 8th of June 1795, aged 10, of a tuberculous disease of the glands after 2 years in conditions the convention itself came to be ashamed of. The physician who performed the autopsy removed his heart and preserved it, and it survived 2 centuries of theft, doubt, and pretenders. In April 2002, laboratories matched its mitochondrial DNA, which descends through the mother, to Marie Antoinette's own line, and the argument ended. Her daughter walked out. Marie-Thérèse Charlotte left the Temple in December 1795, on the eve of her 17th birthday, exchanged for 6 French prisoners. One of them, Jean-Baptiste Drouet, the postmaster who had recognized her father's face and set the pursuit that stopped the family at Varennes. France gave away the man who had caught them to get back the last of the people he had caught. She lived until 1851, the only one of that family to come out alive, and never spoke publicly of it again. Axel von Fersen, who had driven the Berlin out of Paris, was dragged from his carriage by a mob in Stockholm and beaten to death on the 20th of June 1810, 19 years to the day. The coincidence means nothing, and it is impossible not to notice. The necklace never came back either. It had been broken up almost at once, the stones scattered through the jewellers' shops of London by 1785, so that by the time the cardinal came to trial, there was no necklace left to produce in evidence. She never ordered it, never received it, and never once wore it, and it destroyed her monarchy anyway. And go back before the end to a letter written in June 1775, in the middle of the worst bread riots in living memory, by a 19-year-old queen to her mother in Vienna. It is quite certain, she wrote, that in seeing the people who treat us so well despite their own misfortune, we are more obliged than ever to work hard for their happiness. It is conventional piety. But so far as anyone has established, it is the only surviving occasion on which Marie Antoinette put a word on paper about the hunger of French people, and it says the exact opposite of the thing she is famous for saying. The famous line is not even about cake. Brioche is enriched bread, and the English translation made it crueler than the French had ever been. In January 1815, 21 years after they had thrown her into it, a party of workmen went into the old burial ground in the Rue d'Anjou with picks and a plan, looking for a king. They found the Queen first. There was not a great deal left after 2 decades in quicklime, and what allowed the men standing in that hole to say with confidence whose remains they were holding was not a face, or a ring, or a crown. It was clothing. It was a few shreds of cloth and 2 elastic garters, the last things she had put on in the dark on the last morning, in a cell she was not going to leave. France had stripped her on an island in the Rhine at 14, so that she would carry nothing of a foreign court into her new country, and France stripped her again in a prison at 37, and both times the only thing that survived the transaction was a list of her clothes. They took what they found to Saint-Denis and put it under the floor with the kings on the 21st of January 1815, which was the 22nd anniversary of her husband's death. The letter she had written at 4:30 in the morning was read aloud to the deputies of France the following year to men who had mostly voted the other way, and it has been in print ever since. And the sentence, the one everybody knows, the one that is the only thing most people on earth could tell you about her, was written by a Swiss philosopher about a princess he did not name, describing something he said had happened about 20 years before she was born, in a book he was drafting while Marie Antoinette was a 9-year-old girl in Vienna who had never seen France and could not have found it on a map. Nobody accused her of saying it in 1789. Nobody accused her of it at her trial, where they accused her of everything else there was. It was first printed against her name in November 1841 by a Paris journalist called Alphonse Karr, 48 years after she was dead, and Karr hedged it even then. And in April 1843 he printed a retraction because he had gone and looked and found the same story told about somebody else in Tuscany in 1760. He took it back. It made not the slightest difference. It has never made the slightest difference since. And of everything that was taken from her, the clothes on the island, the 7 years, the necklace she never touched, the sun they turned against her, the letter that never arrived, that was the last of it, and it is the only one nobody has ever given back.